So, welcome back again to our second part of working with the SAP Business One service layer. Now that we covered some of the basic concepts pertaining to the service layer, got a glimpse of its underlying infrastructure and architecture, it's time to go ahead and see things in action so we managed to put all those bits and pieces together. If you remember, I mentioned that the service layer is a running service, which is part of the SAP core SAP Business One server components. Once your SAP Business One guys, or let's say the basis guys or the IT professionals, finish the installation and configuration of the service layer, you should be able to log into your SLD or Triple C if you're working in the cloud and find your your service layer endpoint URL. So let's just connect to the Triple C, the Cloud Control Center. If I go to Service Units under HANA, because I'm running a HANA database, I can look at my software components, and if I scroll down, I can see that I have a working service layer. I can click that thing, and if I click that link here and I land at this page, that means that my service layer is up and running for my environment. This is basically says that you're connected. You can access the documentation from here. You can access the API reference from here. So that means that everything's cool, up and running. One more thing that I would like to discuss is something that I also discussed during the first video, is that if I redirect this URL to port 40,000 and then add the backslash or the front slash service layer controller, I land at the service layer controller itself. And there's some basic configurations and settings that I would like to consider when I'm working with the controller. One of them is the authorization header. I discussed it in the first video. We're going to see in a few minutes how this thing is put into action. And then we also have another thing under the advanced configuration that's called session sticky. So the session sticky is also a very important feature that must be ticked. The session stickiness or the session affinity actually ensures that the session stays alive for the entire duration of your web application or whatever you're going to be using in order to when you're working with a service layer. So you won't need to re-log in again and make in order to make subsequent calls. So the session stickiness is a very, very crucial pivotal thing in your integrations. So once we saw that, let's go to Postman and just see how things are working in Postman. So in order to be able to log into the service layer, you have several approaches. So I'm going to be showing you a few of them today. The first one is the classic one, is also, by the way, the longest way of doing things. Not in Postman, but when you're working with third-party applications and when you're actually building a web application or a web service. This will not be the way I would recommend you doing it, but you should know about it. So if you read the service layer documentation, you will see that you need to use the login verb here in your URL. You need to use a post method, and then you need to deliver three parameters or properties in a JSON object that are part of your request. The first one is the username. The second one is the password and the company DB. The username, if you're running in the cloud, will typically be your domain username. And same goes for the password, because you're working in the cloud, so it's a domain user. You will need to be using that one. For the company DB, if you go again to the Triple C and go to tenants, then under database name, you will see all the company DBs that are set up in your environment, in your service unit, so you'll be able to just select which database you would like to connect to. So that will be the value that we put here. If you're running SAP Business One on an on-premise installation, then you will typically use your SAP Business One user code. And a very, very important thing to note is that the user must have the proper authorization to access the service layer. This is something that's being done by a super user in the SAP Business One client, so you do need to get that thing sorted out before you go ahead and connect to the service layer. So once we have that thing in mind, we can go ahead and click send, and we see that there is a response. The response is 200 OK. And we have two cookies here. that were inserted into the response header. The first one is the B1 session, and the second one is a route ID. The B1 session is like the name suggests, it's the actual session that we're connected to right now, and it's alive for the entire duration that it was configured to stay alive. However, the route ID is something that is returned by the Apache server to ensure the load balancer stickiness. So the combination of these two is basically the cookie that you need to use in order to make subsequent calls. You cannot make subsequent calls without using that cookie. So in this case, we're using Postman. Postman is taking care of all these things for us. We don't need to worry about it. If I try to make a subsequent call using Postman, I can go ahead and see that the cookie is all set, and I can see that here, if I go to the headers, I can see that it's the exact same cookie that was just created here, and it just inserts it here. And then if I go ahead and send the request, I will get this order details. I will get order number 1 properties in the response. If I clear the cookies, however, and send a request, it will say that the session is invalid or timed out. That's very obvious because we do need to be able to log into the session before we make any subsequent calls. So Postman is taking care of it for us. If I do a login and then I go ahead and make a subsequent call, it will work. What happens when you're working from within an application and you want to achieve this? So this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, and I'm going to show you a few approaches on how to deal with it. So the best way is to go ahead and go to Power Automate. In Power Automate, I created a very simple flow here where I'm just basically using the same login request that I just used in Postman with the JSON body and all the connection strings that I used. And once I get the response, then I use that header cookie header in order to get the values that I need for these subsequent calls. So let's see how it looks like. If I test the flow, run it, ran successfully, I connected here, I can see that I get a logging request. If I go to the outputs and I look at the set cookie header, I can see that the set cookie header is a very long string with a lot of values in it, but I just need 2 of them. I need the B1 session and I need the route ID. And in order to get those, I need to make some string manipulations here to that string to get that final cookie, in order to get that final cookie that I'm using for subsequent calls. So now that I got the cookie, I can go ahead, edit the flow, add an HTTP request again, and let's say it's a get method. I'm going to get the same request that I got from Postman, but in this case I need to insert that final cookie into here. Otherwise this request will return a 401 unauthorized response. So I need to use dynamic content outputs. I can save the flow and then I can run it. And I can see that the call was successful and I got everything that I wanted from that order. So this is a good method. It's an okay method, but it's a little bit pricey when it comes to performance. We want to be more agile and more responsive in our apps. So I would not recommend going through all these steps. There's another way of achieving this, which is something that it's like a more of a direct way of calling the service layer without going through all this login phase. And it's by using a base64 authorization header. So if I added the authorization header to the service layer controller, if you remember, it was exactly for that purpose. So I'm able to add an authorization header in the form of a base64 string. And that base64 string is basically a representation of my credentials, of my username and company DB and company name, or and of course the password. So this will be whatever goes into the authorization header. So it really doesn't matter if I have a cookie or not. I'm going to clear all the cookies. I'm going to make a request, making it a little bit more of a more complicated request. For that specific order, I'm adding some OData query. But as you can see, I got a response. I got a good response. And it really doesn't matter how many times I'm going to clear the cookies, or if I'm not even logged in. Using the classic login method, I will always be able to be logged in, to be making that call, working with a service layer. So that's another cool way, just so to see how it works from within an app. So I take that value, go back to my flow, edit it, and then all I need to do is to get rid of that cookie, stick that value here, and add the authorization header. Save it. And now I can test it and can see that even without the cookie, the request will be successful and I can get the response that I need. Okay, so that's another way of doing things in a much more direct way without going through all these steps. So there is a third way also, which is also more, gives you some more options in terms of how you want to generalize your apps. And this is done by creating custom connectors. So we can leverage Power Apps, custom connectors, and use the Power Platform in order to create a custom connector in order to connect to the service layer. I'm going to delete that connector, save the flow, and go to Power Apps. So in Power Apps, if you cannot find the custom connectors, all you need to do is to go to More, Discover All. If you scroll down, you can pin this to your menu tree and go to Custom Connectors. And you can add a new connector here. Let's call it Service Layer B1 Demo. Continue. I'm using the HTTPS method. My host name is still the same. Go to security. In the security, I'm going to choose basic authentication, and I'm going to create just 2 parameters here. They're going to be used to establish a connection to that connector later on. So I'm going to use a uname and password. It's really doesn't matter. It's just a random name. Go to definition, create a new action. I'm going to call that get entity, let's say get B1 entity. I'm going to stick it here and here. And the cool thing starts now. We can say import from sample. If I go to that complex query that I created here, complex API call that I created here, I can just put it here as a get method. Of course, I can create a new action for each of those methods, but I'm just trying to showcase how it works. And I can just go ahead and generalize it a little bit by using some syntax. So I can open up a curly bracket and say, for example, resource path, close it, and then leave the rest of the OData query here. Of course, I can add some headers. For example, it even gives me, like here, an example. Like I can use content type application JSON. I can add some more headers. I can even use my own base 64 string authorization header. Although for custom connectors, it's less recommended. In most cases, it's not even going to work. So you might as well do it like that, and then you'll see how you can establish a connection to the connectors. So normally it will not accept the authorization header, but in theory, this is also something that you can think about. So if I click import, then Power Apps understands the syntax and it parses it to the right section. So I have a path and I have a query. I can edit it. I can just say that it's an important piece, and then I can go to the query and I can say that it's required and important. And that's pretty much it. I can create the connector. And once the connector is created, I can later use it in my apps. Let's see it now. It's created. Okay, So we go to custom connectors. Let's just refresh the screen. And this is my new connector here, service layer B1 demo. I can go to my flow. I can go to custom, service layer B1 demo. Here it is, and there I will establish my connection. Let's call it demo service layer. And of course, the username is exactly like I told you before. If we go again to that post method, we can just take that username, add the company DB, and then the password, create a connection to that connector. I can say orders. I can call order number 1 and select all the properties, save it, and test it. So that will allow me, once I do that, that will allow me to use pretty much every entity I want. So in this case I use orders, but I might as well use invoices. I can use deliveries, whatever I want to use that exists in the API. As long as it's a valid resource path, I can use it. I can make API calls, and this is how I manage to create a custom connector and call the service layer and get a response from SAP. So we've seen 3 methods today. This was more of a real life demo, putting things in action a little bit of all this theory that we reviewed in the past 2 videos. But now you can see how you can connect to the service layer using various methods. If it's using the classic login method and then using the cookies or basic authentication headers or using a custom connector. So if you have any questions, comments, please don't hesitate to post it and just comment. Take care and enjoy your integrations. Ciao.